a good long program to get through, and we want to give everyone an opportunity for questions. Hi, I'm Kevin Byrne. I'm Consul General at the Irish Consulate here in Chicago. You're all very welcome to this evening's event, a lecture from Ireland's ambassadors Dan Mulhall on the history of Ireland 1921 and 22, the beginnings of the Free State. It's a complex period in our history, but it really is so key to understanding the events of the century that followed. My father always says every day is a school day, so we'll all learn something this evening, and there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. You can just pop your question in the chat in Zoom, and we'll try to get through as many questions as possible. Before we start, on behalf of the Consulate, I want to thank our partners for this evening's lecture, the Irish Studies Programme at DePaul University, the Irish Studies Scholarly Seminar at the Newberry Library, and the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University. I'll now hand over to Mary McCain, Director of the Irish Studies Programme at DePaul, and our partners for some brief words before I introduce the Ambassador. Mary.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'd like to add my own warm note of welcome to all the attendees and to our distinguished guest, the Ambassador, and to my co-sponsors. Thank you all very much for making time in your evening to join us. I particularly thank Ambassador Mulhall for the time he has spent in preparing and now delivering his remarks tonight. I'm very eager to hear and get a conversation started about this key moment in modern Irish history. The Irish Studies program is an interdisciplinary minor at DePaul that attracts students from all across the university, not just the perhaps typical departments of history and English. Those students who declare the minor, as well as many others who take our courses but don't formally take the minor, really relish, I think, studying Ireland's history, literature, and culture. And my colleagues and I are so grateful and deeply value the opportunities to let them expand their knowledge with opportunities such as this and hear about Ireland's history, in this case, from new perspectives. So again, I welcome everyone to the event. I thank the Ambassador so much and the Consulate for your work in organizing this and your invitation to collaborate with you once again, which is always such an honor and a pleasure. I will turn it over to a distinguished co-sponsor representing a central and crucial Chicago institution, Keelan Burke of the Newberry Library.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I would like to echo Mary in her thanks to all of you for joining and to the Consulate and for the Ambassador for what is going to be no doubt a very exciting talk this afternoon, evening. I guess it's evening now, it is dark outside. For those of you who are not familiar with the Newberry Library, we are an independent research library located in Chicago, Illinois. Among our many public and scholarly programming, we host an Irish Studies scholarly seminar that meets 5 or 6 times per year to discuss works in progress papers by scholars across disciplines in Irish studies. We also, as a humanities library, hold a vast archive of modern and early modern materials. So we have a fair amount of exciting Irish things in the collection. If anybody ever can make it down in person in the after times, we look forward to that. I also want to say thank you to all the co-sponsors, and we're very excited this afternoon. I will now pass things along to David Wellman, Director of the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University.
Well, good evening. I'd just like to echo everybody's thanks to Ambassador Mulhall for joining us this evening. It's great to welcome you back to Chicago, if only virtually. We look forward to having you back in person. So on behalf of the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy, I really want to express my gratitude to the organizers for the opportunity to co-sponsor this compelling event. And I'd also like to express our thanks to the Irish Vice Consul Sarah Keating, Consul General Kevin Byrne, Mary McCain, of course, of the DePaul's Irish Studies Program, and Keelan Burke of the Newberry Library for making this evening possible. The Gray School of Applied Diplomacy is dedicated to educating both future Foreign Service officers as well as practitioners of diplomacy across all vocations. In order to practice diplomacy, all of our students must be grounded in a deep understanding of history. And it is for this reason that I'm so delighted that the DePaul community has the opportunity to hear tonight's presentation. So now let me turn things over to Consul General Byrne, who will introduce our honored speaker for this evening.
Thank you, David, and thanks to Keelan and to Mary as well. It's been a pleasure to work with you in the preparation of this, and thanks to Vice Consul Sarah Keating, who's been central to the organization. Ambassador Dan Mulhall took up duty as Ireland's 18th ambassador to the United States in summer of 2017. Prior to taking up duty in DC, he was our ambassador in London from 2013 to 2017. He has also served as our ambassador to Germany and Malaysia, as well as a whole host of distinguished posts in headquarters and overseas. As well as a diplomat, Ambassador Mulhall is a historian, having completed postgraduate studies in modern history in University College Cork. And as well, as many of you will know, he's a big fan of Irish poetry and a real champion for the Irish arts. Before I hand over to the ambassador, I'd like to remind you that you can pop questions into the chat box. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions of the ambassador at the end. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Ambassador Dan Mulhall. Ambassador, please.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Consul General. Thank you to all of the co-sponsors, to Mary, to David, and to Keelan. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I had the pleasure of visiting Chicago about a year ago, I suppose, in the real world. And now I'm visiting in the virtual world, but I hope to get back again in the real world before too long, as soon as it's safe to travel and have in-person events again, which I hope will happen sometime next year. So look, I have the sense that Irish Americans have a huge interest in Irish history. I know this from talking to people and realizing just how much interest they take in the subject, and I'm keen to feed that interest by doing what I can as a historian to talk about aspects of Irish history which are current. And nothing is more current now than the centenary of the War of Independence and the advent of Irish independence in 1921-22. And that's the subject of my talk this evening. And, you know, my sense is that this is a difficult period to get to grips with. And I do intend to organize a series of lectures over the first 6 months of next year to try and delve more deeply into some of these issues, because I won't be able to cover them all in full detail here this evening, but I'll do my best to sort of cover the ground in a more general way. And then these events that I'm planning for next year, I hope we'll get into the greater detail and dig more deeply into the history of that period. So, because I think for people, the Easter Rising of 1916 is a relatively straightforward event to come to terms with. It was a heroic event. You know, people went out and fought a battle against overwhelming odds, and they triumphed in the end because the Rising led on to a national struggle for independence, which culminated in the formation of the Irish Free State in 1922. The period we're talking about now, which is the War of Independence period, is a little more difficult because it's more complicated. There's a lot more strands that feed into it, and a lot more complexities, a lot more controversy, if you like, especially when it comes to the Civil War, which followed hot on the heels of the War of Independence and the coming of Irish independence. So I call this talk the Advent of Irish Independence. So it's not focused exclusively on 1921-22, but that was the culmination of what I'm going to talk about. So when it comes to Irish history, you always have to ask where to start, right? And you know, I sometimes start in 1169 with the coming of the Normans to Ireland, but I'll spare you that one because that's probably going back a bit too far. Or you could start at the Act of Union of 1800, which of course unified the parliaments of Britain and Ireland, and then created a kind of a national struggle that went on for 120 years for some form of self-government, initially home rule and then eventually independence. So, but I won't start there either. I'm going to start in the year 1914. So why do I start that year? Well, two things happened that year. First of all, we had the passage through the Westminster Parliament of the Home Rule Act of 1914. It had been delayed by a few years because of resistance in the House of Lords, but finally that was overcome in 1914, and the act was passed. And at that time, I would say, you know, there was great jubilation when the act was passed, and the vast majority of Irish people at that stage would have been happy to have a home rule Ireland. In other words, an Ireland with its own parliament, part of the British Empire, but with its own government in Dublin, running Irish affairs, but then being part of the wider enterprise for foreign policy and defence and so forth. And then the Deus Ex Machina intervened, the Black Swan event. We're used to that this year, but the Black Swan event in 1914, of course, was the unexpected outbreak of the First World War. And that changed everything in Ireland, because the the First World War, first of all, caused the Home Rule Act to be deferred. In other words, it was meant to come into force in 1914. The war broke out, and the British government conveniently said, "Okay, we can't have it now, so we put it back to the end of the war." And of course, nobody knew when the end of the war might come about. So, and that, of course, that event split nationalist Ireland deeply, and it led on to the events that I'm going to describe in this talk, because a majority of the Irish Volunteers, remember, the Irish Volunteers were established in order to counter the Ulster Volunteers, who were set up in order to resist the imposition of Home Rule on Ireland, because Ulster Unionists saw Home Rule as a threat to their British identity, didn't want to be part of any Home Rule Ireland, and were willing to resist Home Rule by force of arms. The Irish Volunteers were established by Owen MacNeill and others as a nationalist Irish response to the emergence of the Ulster Volunteers. And in 1914, the Irish Volunteers probably had 150,000 members or thereabouts. And when the war came, the movement split. And the majority went with John Redmond, the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, whose argument was that Irish people should enlist to fight in the Great War for the freedom of small nations, for Catholic Belgium, all that stuff. And the majority of Irish volunteers went along with Redmond, and many of them enlisted in the First World War, and many Irish people died in that war. But a minority of the Irish volunteers refused to go along with Redmond. And about 15,000 Irish volunteers said, "No, we're not going to war. We're staying in Ireland. We're going to fight the good fight here in order to be ready to struggle for Irish independence, not on the battlefields of Europe, but here in Ireland." And the upshot of all of this was that during the First World War, while more than 200,000 Irishmen were fighting on the Western Front and elsewhere in Gallipoli, and 30,000 or so, 40,000 lost their lives in that war. The Irish volunteers were at home in Ireland, training, doing maneuvers, basically getting ready for a struggle that they believed would happen at some stage in the course of the coming years. And the struggle was really supposed to be for Home Rule, because at that stage, the assumption was that the First World War would be over in a year or less, and that then the Home Rule issue would come back again, and the Irish volunteers wanted to be ready to fight the good fight rather than going off and losing their lives on the battlefields of Europe. So in 1916, the volunteers, led by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was an oath-bound secret society, so that people didn't know who was in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, but they actually managed to gain control of the Irish volunteers. And the IRB, or as they were called, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, decided that 1916 was a time when a rebellion against British rule in Ireland should take place. Now, the rising was a failed success. In other words, it failed on the day, in that the volunteers were defeated in Dublin within 5 days. But the fact they held out for 5 days was a pretty significant achievement, given the weight of force that the British government were able to bring to bear in the battle against the Irish volunteers in Dublin in Easter week 1916. But they succeeded, because eventually the Easter Rising ended up leading to Irish independence 6 years later. So they were vanquished on the day in 1916. Many of them were executed for because of their role in the Easter Rising. 15 leaders of the Rising, or prominent people in the Rising, were executed. And 6 years later, that sacrifice they made, which looked at the time to be a pretty reckless one, turned out to have been the seed that produced Irish independence in 1922. So W.B. Yeats wrote in his famous poem, Easter 1916, that everything had been changed utterly by the Easter Rising. Now, when Yeats wrote those words in September 1916, because he wrote them a few months after the Rising itself, that was by no means a guaranteed outcome. I mean, it was no guarantee that the Easter Rising would have changed Ireland utterly in that way that Yeats predicted. But he was right. He had his finger on the button, and he was right. He got it right. But at that time, many people in Ireland took the view that, well, okay, these hotheads, went out, and so they were fine people and all that, and they sacrificed their lives. But in the end, the more mature politicians in the Irish Party would have to come back into the fray, and they would have to negotiate an outcome for Ireland and deliver home rule after the war ended. That didn't happen. And why did it not happen? It didn't happen because those who had fought in the Rising, once they were released from prison in Britain, as they were in the months and up to a year following the Rising, they organized themselves very effectively into a national movement under the banner of Sinn Féin, a party formed by Arthur Griffith in 1905, but now transformed into a nationalist movement, into a broad nationalist movement under the leadership of Eamon de Valera. Now, I have to explain about Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin was formed, as I said, by Arthur Griffith in 1904-5. And Griffith's idea at that time was that independence in the kind of classic sense of an independent republic was probably not achievable because of the lack of ability to persuade the British to grant independence to Ireland, but that maybe what he called a dual monarchy or Austro-Hungarian style monarchy. He looked back at what Austria and Hungary had done in the 1860s, when the Austrians had managed to persuade the Hungarians had risen against the Austrians and had persuaded them to allow the empire, as it was at that time, to be turned into a dual monarchy, whereby you had an Austrian part and a Hungarian part, but both belonged to the same empire, governed by the Emperor Franz Joseph at that time. So Griffith thought that this would be a good model for Ireland, and that therefore he was looking not for independence, not for a republic, but for a dual monarchy. And of course, his way of achieving that was to withdraw Irish politicians from Westminster and set up a government in Ireland that would simply ignore the fact that it was formally or officially part of the United Kingdom and would basically run its own affairs. And that's precisely what Sinn Féin did in 1919 and 1920, following that aspect of Griffith's philosophy. But of course, the dual monarchy idea went out the window, and Sinn Féin, as in from 1917, was looking for independence, outright independence, rather than any sort of halfway house like a dual monarchy. So in 1917-18, there were a series of by-elections, and Sinn Féin won some notable victories, but it also lost a few of the by-elections, and the Irish Party didn't go down without a fight. They battled hard, because I remember these people had been kingpins of Irish politics for 30 years in most cases. They've been around for a long time. They were all the ones who were prominent in the 1916, 17, 18 period were all acolytes of Charles Stuart Parnell from the 1890s. So they were very experienced politicians, and they didn't go down without a fight. And they had a lot of support in Ireland, let's be honest. But anyway, we come to the election of 1918, and the Irish Party was more or less wiped out, virtually wiped out. I mean, extraordinary event, really, an almost unparalleled event in Irish political history, before or since, in that a party that had had total domination, that had maybe 70 or more of the seats in Ireland, the others were held by Unionists. In 1918, after the election of that year, that month of December 1918, they were down to a half a dozen seats. Extraordinary collapse of a party that had been dominant for so long, the party of Parnell, the party of Redmond, and so forth. Sinn Féin, of the 100 seats available to Irish constituencies, Sinn Féin won 73 seats. Now, they didn't actually get a majority of the votes, but in a first past the post system, they didn't need a majority of the votes. They needed to get more than any other party, and they managed that. And there wasn't a huge gap between Sinn Féin and the Irish Party, but it was enough of a gap to give Sinn Féin more or less complete victory in that election of December 1918. The Irish Party weren't helped by the the ham-fisted effort on the part of the British government in 1918 to introduce compulsory conscription, to conscript Irish people into the war, and that caused revulsion in nationalist Ireland, and it united all of the factions. And therefore, you could say that the British government didn't exactly stand over or weren't exactly helpful to the Irish Party, despite the fact that the Irish Party had been so loyal in urging its supporters to enlist to fight on the battlefields of the First World War. So, in other words, the conscription crisis basically, was a death knell for the Irish Party. So, in January 1919, the first Dáil met, and this was again a Griffith idea that you don't go to Westminster, you don't take your seats in Westminster, you have your own parliament in Dublin. And that parliament met on the 21st of January 1919. And immediately, that first day, they issued 3 documents. One was, well, first of all, they established a constitution for the new Irish state, which they were forming, although nobody recognized it. The first major document was a Declaration of Independence, which was adopted unanimously. The second document was an appeal to the free nations of the world. In other words, an appeal to the international community to recognize Irish independence. And that appeal was essentially directed at this country, at America, at the Irish American community. We want you to help us to get recognition for our new state. We need our people abroad to assert themselves. And Irish Americans, to their great credit, did so and were very active in trying to put pressure on the American administration to be supportive of Irish independence. The next step was for the Irish delegation to go to the Versailles Conference, where they tried in vain to be given an opportunity to present the case for Ireland, for Irish independence at the Versailles Conference. Woodrow Wilson wasn't very supportive, and even though a lot of pressure came on from Irish Americans, it didn't do the trick, and the Irish didn't get what they wanted. So then we start the War of Independence. Now, the War of Independence, first of all, was not a war in the conventional sense of the word, because there were no pitched battles. The Irish volunteers, as they were called, it eventually became known as the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. But in the beginning, they were called the Irish Volunteers because that was the name they had before, when they were established before the First World War. So they decided not to make the same mistake that was made in 1916, which was to occupy public buildings where you became a sitting duck for the British, the overwhelming military power the British could deploy against any Irish insurgents. So the Irish War of Independence was actually a series of ambushes and then retaliatory moves on the part of the British authorities. So there were no pitched battles, unlike 1916. It was basically the Irish volunteers realized that they couldn't win a pitched battle, so they avoided pitched battles, and they used their knowledge of the countryside and the support they had from the population at large to sort of melt away into the wider population, and therefore avoid being apprehended by the authorities. And of course, this was this War of Independence was, compared with other conflicts that occurred in other parts of Europe over that period and beyond, it was relatively small death toll. About 1,450 people lost their lives. Many of them, of course, were innocent civilians who happened to be caught up in the retaliation that was unleashed by the British authorities in Ireland after ambushes of various kinds that took place during the War of Independence. And I'm calling it the War of Independence, even though it wasn't a war, but still, I'm calling it that because that's what we call it. That's the conventional way of referring to that period in our history. But what the War of Independence did was that it was a rare phenomenon, because this is the first time since the rebellion of 1798 that an Irish nationalist movement was able to mount a serious, sustained challenge to British power in Ireland. Remember, even that rebellion of 1798 was relatively short-lived, although it's, you know, there was a long aftermath when there were reprisals, and you had the, you know, the landing of the French and so on. So it was a sustained period, unlike the Fenian Rebellion, which fizzled out very quickly. The rebellion of 1848, the Young Ireland Rebellion, again fizzled out quickly. Robert Emmet was a one-day affair in 1803 in Dublin. So the track record wasn't great, mainly because the overwhelming power of the British system in Ireland was such that it meant that organising a proper insurrection was very difficult, because all these movements tended to be riddled with spies and informers put into them by Dublin Castle, which was the seat of British power in Ireland. So what you had in 1920 and 1921 were a series of ambushes, reprisals, further reprisals, ambushes, and so forth. So it dragged on for a year and a half. Well, for 2.5 years, from January 1919, the same day as the first Dáil met, there was an ambush at Solihead Beg in County Tipperary, where a unit led by Seamus Robinson, Dan Breen, and Tom Barry ambushed an RIC, a Royal Irish Constabulary group, who were transporting some ammunition from one place to another, and they were ambushed, and a number of members of the Royal Irish Constabulary were killed in that exchange. And that really led to that was the trigger for the War of Independence. And the war went on until June of 1921, when a ceasefire was declared and negotiations started between the Irish volunteers, between Sinn Féin and the British government, on how to resolve this conflict. Throughout the period of 1919, 20, 21, the government that was established at that time under the leadership of Eamon de Valera, and, you know, they appointed ministers and so forth who were in charge of different things, and they also set up courts, a court system, which was quite effective. And in fact, a lot of cases were resolved by the Sinn Féin courts, as they were called. So they tried their very best to establish an alternative administration that simply tried to ignore what was happening in the British administration in Ireland, and establish a parallel Irish administration which Irish people would go to for solutions to the issues that concerned them, rather than relying on the British system in Ireland. Now, it wasn't completely successful, because clearly the country was still being run from Dublin Castle, and with oversight from London. But nonetheless, the Sinn Féin government at the time performed a lot better than I think people would have expected at the beginning, because these were very young people. I mean, think of Michael Collins, was Minister for Finance in that first Dáil. I mean, Collins was in his 30s. Eamon de Valera, the president, was born was still in his 30s also. He was born in 1882. He was only in his late 30s when the War of Independence broke out. Likewise, the other ministers in the government, apart from Arthur Griffith, who was a little bit older, he'd been around for a lot longer. But someone like Cathal Brugha, Austin Stack, these people were all, they were all people born in the 1880s or 1890s. So it was a young person's revolution, and the people who came on board and became part of the fledgling Irish government were very young people with very limited experience of how to do anything, but they proved to be quite effective despite their lack of experience. And Collins especially was a very able Minister for Finance, and managed to raise funds, and managed to at least run the place, generating enough funding to run the alternative government of Ireland during that difficult period. So there were various major events during the War of Independence that I want to mention. The first one I will mention was the killing of the Lord Mayor of Cork, Thomas McCurtain, who was an elected member of Parliament, but was in an exchange with British forces in Ireland at that time. And then, of course, his successor, Terence McSweeney, died after a long hunger strike in Brixton Prison in London. And that generated huge international interest and sympathy for the Irish cause. I remember when I was in India in the 1980s, I met with the sister of Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first Prime Minister of India, and the whole Nehru family had been heavily involved in the Indian independence struggle. And she told me how much inspiration the Indian struggle had drawn from the Irish struggle. And she said her first interest in this issue was generated by witnessing in the media, in the Indian newspapers, the slow death of Terence McSweeney, which really, she said, energized people of her generation who had great sympathy for what was happening in Ireland. And then that led on to providing some inspiration for the Indian struggle for independence. There was the execution of Kevin Barry, which was just recently reached its centenary and was commemorated. And there are now 2 books actually by descendants of Kevin Barry, or by members of the the family, or descendants of the family of Kevin Barry have published books about Kevin Barry. He was only when members of the Irish Volunteers, at the behest of Michael Collins, killed a dozen members of the British intelligence forces in Ireland. And then in retaliation that afternoon, British forces entered Croke Park and fired on the crowd, and 12 people were killed there as well, and 60 were injured. So this is the kind of thing that happened during the War of Independence, which was very clearly very, very bloody and difficult and so forth. And that's why, commemorating these events is important, because, some really terrible things happened, and Bloody Sunday was one of those. Now, of course, there were other events. You had the burning of Balbregan in September 1920 by the Black and Tans, and you had the burning of Cork in November 1920 by the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. I should explain, and of course that was in retaliation for an ambush that took place at Kilmichael in County Cork, where a significant number of British forces were killed by the IRA. I should explain about the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. There were 2 separate forces, and the Black and Tans were recruited because the number of members of the Royal Irish Constabulary dropped once the conflict started, because obviously a lot of these RIC members were Irish, were Catholics, and they were suddenly targets of potential assassination by people in the local communities. So a lot of them simply resigned their commissions and refused to risk their lives at that time, because of the atmosphere that was generated in the period between 1919 and 1921. And in order to boost their forces in Ireland, the British recruited a special force of, a lot of them were veterans of the First World War, or they were people who had been in the police force, maybe in Britain, and were recruited to come over and take part in the struggle against the IRA in Ireland. And then the auxiliaries were another force established, and they were pretty notorious. In fact, the commanding officer, when he finally resigned, said that he couldn't bear to be commanding a force of such disreputable people. So between them, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries became notorious in Ireland, and I think generated a lot of resentment and so forth, and didn't do the British cause in Ireland any good, because of course burning Cork, burning Balbregan. I mean, it was done probably in a kind of a fit of anger and retaliation for what the IRA may have done in ambushing Crown forces in Ireland. But I mean, any government responsible for burning down the second city or the third city in its jurisdiction, is not going to be on any kind of winning ticket when it comes to international opinion. And international opinion did turn against the British in a big way, and especially here in the United States. And that was a big factor in encouraging the British to finally negotiate with Sinn Féin and negotiate an outcome that both sides could accept. Now, of course, there were other countries that achieved independence in the years after the First World War. I speak of Hungary, the Czech Republic, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. All those countries emerged from the First World War. And then, of course, there was the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. It became Yugoslavia eventually. But the difference between those countries and the Irish struggle was that in those cases, they emerged from the ruins of defeated empires. The distinction that Ireland held at that time and still holds is that our struggle for independence took place against a successful empire. In other words, one of the empires that had won the First World War. And it wasn't going to fall apart and allow Ireland to become independent just like that. In other words, the other countries kind of found their independence because the states they were part of fell apart. In our case, it was necessary to have a sustained struggle in order to achieve the independence that Irish people clearly wanted. Now, during the War of Independence, let's look at the balance of forces. In all, if you count the RIC or the remnants of the RIC, what was left of the RIC, the police, the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, and the British Army, you had 40,000 or so British forces in Ireland. Now, the volunteers, the Irish volunteers, nominally had 15,000 men, 15,000 members. But of course, most of them didn't have weapons, or if they had, they were very inferior weapons to the weapons that the British forces had, which were the latest and greatest weapons that were available at that time. Secondly, of course, the Irish volunteers were not a professional army. They were amateurs doing what they could to fight an almighty struggle against a far superior force. And the 15,000 that I mentioned there, that was just a nominal membership. It's estimated that the actual number of volunteers who were really active in the struggle for independence in those years is about 3,000. So you can see 40,000 against 3,000. It's not a fair fight. It's only possible to win that kind of fight if you can deploy the kind of methods that the IRA deployed of surprise attacks, ambushes, and so on. You could never win that kind of fight in any more conventional way. And you also, of course, had to rely on wearing the British down. And that's what happened in the end. So how did the Irish volunteers, the IRA, Sinn Féin manage to force the British government into conceding what they didn't want to concede at the beginning, which was to negotiate some form of independence for Ireland? The answer is that British public opinion and the British political system, after a certain amount of time, by 1921, realized that they could only defeat the Irish by deploying ruthlessly the forces at their disposal. And that would have meant, really cracking down on Ireland, using such an amount of force that the Irish would have had to give in. But of course, the problem with that was that you'd have to do things that the British public at that time wouldn't have been willing to accept. They would have been willing to accept it 100 years before, in the 1830s or 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s. But by the 20th century, given the changes in society and so on, there wasn't the same will on the part of of the British public or the British political system to kind of endure the sort of incredibly bad publicity that would have been generated and the hostility that would have been directed at them by international opinion. That was, I think, a big part of the story. And I think the Irish Americans in that regard played a huge part. So what happened was eventually the British government offered to negotiate with Sinn Féin. So this is a British government at the maximum extent of its power, having triumphed in the greatest war in the history of the world, or the bloodiest war in the history of the modern world, decided eventually, 3 years later, that they would negotiate with people they would have regarded as a kind of a ragtail group of, nobodies who had no kind of reputation, no standing at all, except that they had been able to conduct this successful struggle for independence, which eventually forced the British government to the negotiating table. Now, the treaty negotiations are a highly contested field in Irish history, and I can't go into all of what happened at that time. That's something that I think we should go into in one of these sessions that I'm hoping to organize next year with the support of universities around the United States, like DePaul. But in a nutshell, De Valera, who was the leader of the Irish struggle, leader of the Irish government that hadn't been recognized by anybody, but was acting as if it were a government in Ireland. He decided, for whatever reason, not to go to London for the negotiations. Instead, Griffith and Collins and others were sent over to negotiate an outcome. And De Valera believed that they would have to come back and consult him before they would agree to anything. The best laid plans, and of course, remember in those days, there was no email, there was no, communications were difficult. They'd have had to travel back to Ireland really to consult De Valera. And the negotiations developed to a point where Collins and Griffith decided to sign the Anglo-Irish Treaty without referring back to De Valera. And this was the root of the subsequent problems that really ravaged Ireland for the following years, and in fact, to some degree, left a legacy of bitterness that lasted for decades after the 1920s. So, what the treaty didn't give Ireland what the maximalist demand would have been, which was an Irish Republic, totally free of Britain, and with a 32-county all-island remit. It didn't give it that. Instead, it gave Ireland what was called at the time Dominion status. In other words, it would have the same status as Australia and Canada had at that time, and the king would still be the head of state of Ireland. Ireland would be part of the British Empire, and there would be an oath of allegiance, which would have to be sworn in order for people to take part in the political system in Ireland under the arrangements that were set out in the treaty. And those issues became hugely controversial. And when Collins and Griffith and the delegation came back to Ireland, a deep split arose, and a bitterness developed, which I think surprising, given that they had been all together in the one boat for the previous 5 years since the Easter Rising. Basically, they split almost down the middle, but the treaty was eventually accepted by a majority of the members of the Dáil at that time, and that then led on to Sinn Féin splitting and the creation of Cumann na nGaedheal, which became the first government of the Irish Free State, and then Fianna Fáil emerged in 1926. So why did this national movement that was so impressive and so effective in prosecuting Ireland's demand for independence. Why did it fail, or why did it divide in this way? Well, my own view is that, like a lot of these things, it was a very broad movement. It was a movement that had many elements, you know, because it was such a broad movement. It had a lot of people with different views, and they couldn't. There was no single vision, maybe, of the future, and the commitment to a republic was always a little bit vague. It was there, but it was not everyone, I think, in the Sinn Féin movement necessarily had the same view of the importance of the republic as De Valera and those who supported him in 1921 had. So I think there was a sense of inevitability, really, that that a national movement as broad as that should eventually divide. Remember, there were people, like, you have to look at it this way. By 1921, there were people who were supporting Sinn Féin who had been supporters of the Irish Party, who would have been happy a few years before with some home rule, version of home rule. They were the older members of Sinn Féin that were Griffith supporters that originally, remember, were looking only for a dual monarchy. So you can imagine for them, you know, what was available in 1921 was sufficient for their needs. And then you had some people who had come in to the struggle later on and who were dedicated to the idea of a republic and wouldn't accept anything less than a republic. So you had a broad church movement, and to some extent, under the pressure of events, I think perhaps a split of some kind was inevitable. Sadly, that split burdened Ireland for generations afterwards, and you know, the Civil War broke out in 1922. It was short-lived, but in a small country like Ireland, and given the relationships between the people who were involved on both sides and the leaders had been, you know, had been interconnected for years, you know, sort of best men at each other's weddings and so forth. I mean, it was a short but bitter struggle between people who were friends and colleagues and comrades for so long that it was quite surprising that the bitterness that emerged into the Civil War in 1922-23. So that's more or less broadly what I wanted to say. Just a final point is that, and I become conscious, as I mentioned already, the example of India and Nehru's sister I met there in the 1980s, Mrs. Vijayalakshmi Pandit, whose granddaughter was a friend of mine. I met Mrs. Pandit through her granddaughter. You know, I learned from her how important the Irish struggle had been as an inspiration to India. Other people in India told me the same story. Obviously, the Irish struggle had also a resonance in Africa and many African countries. I remember once holding an event at the embassy in Berlin when I was there to commemorate the first Irish delegation that came to Germany to try and generate support in Germany for Irish independence. And a number of my African colleagues turned up, and I was quite surprised at this because I'd invited them, but I hadn't expected them to turn up. And they said, all of them said to me, "Oh, anything to do with your history, with your independence struggle, is part of our history." So there's that sense in which Ireland blazed a trail and pointed the way forward for countries that, in the decades that followed, had their own desire to break away from successful empires like the British and French empires that were gradually, you know, reduced by the demand for independence from their subject peoples throughout Africa and Asia. And you know, the Civil War, on a finish on that, I mean, it was a terrible event, and to some extent, the Civil War, or its political legacy, reached its terminus a few months ago, when the two parties that are descended, or two of the parties descended from the Sinn Féin movement of 1916 to 1921, are now in government together, having for 100 years been on opposite sides of the fence and governed, one or the other has governed Ireland for 100 years, and now the two parties are in government together, just in time for the centenary of the Civil War, which will be a difficult centenary, but it's one that I believe we will manage. But I want to finish by reading W.B. Yeats's, or from a little bit from W.B. Yeats's Meditations in Time of Civil War. Yeats was in Turballylee in County Galway, and he witnessed some of the events of the Civil War which were happening around him in that part of the west of Ireland. But he says, we had fed the heart on fantasies. The heart's grown brutal from the fair. More substance in our enmities than in our love. Oh, honeybees, come build in the empty house of the stair. I think that very wise kind of description, the heart's grown brutal. And the heart did grow brutal in 1922-23 during the Civil War. And happily, our country has maintained a democratic tradition for 100 years, something I'm immensely proud of, because democracy went down in flames in so many parts of Europe in the 1930s and 40s. In Ireland, we preserved that democratic tradition, despite the fact that the heart had grown brutal as a result of the Civil War. The heart had grown brutal, but we managed all the same to transcend those brutalities, to transcend those fantasies, and to establish a successful democratic state, now 100 years in being, which I've had the honor to serve for the last 42 years. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, Ambassador, I am sure that I speak for all of us when I thank you for this really very masterful synthesis and summary of, as you mentioned at the outset, such a complex, chronologically a very short period of time in so many kinds of ways, but a very complex era. And I think it is a marvelous start of a conversation, as you were thinking. We did have a question, and I encourage any attendee to pop another question into the chat. You're very welcome to do so. With the anonymous questioner's permission, I hope I have it. There is a question about which Irish poet would you choose to meet? But I'd like, and given your conclusion, I know you might choose Yeats, but I wonder if you could meet one of the poets of this era, whether from the cultural revival of the late 19th into the 20th century. So I think of Pierce wrote poems, Yeats, of course, Francis Ledwidge. Tom Kettle was not a poet, but I have to say, when I think of his poem to his infant daughter,
Eddie,
yes, I still, it's hard for me to think of it without deep emotion.
No, it's a very emotional poem. Yeah,
yeah,
that's a very good question. You know,
isn't it? Yeah.
I often thought of all the Irish writers. You know, I mean, I can see drawbacks with meeting all of them. I think Yeats would have maybe talked over my head and tried to kind of make me feel like a kind of country bumpkin because of his kind of, you know, rather kind of exotic,
yes, the esoteric, yes.
Esoteric, yes, I would say exotic and esoteric will be the two words I would use.
Right.
And then, you know, I mean, Joyce, you know, again, it's sort of an awkward kind of customer in many ways. You know, you might get on the right side of it, but you might not. You get on the right side of it, it could be a very unpleasant sort of experience for you. So, and then, you know, Patrick Kavanagh, you know, beautiful poet, but quite an awkward specimen, you know, a bit of an awkward individual who, you know, was a bit sort of too taken to imbibing excessive imbibing probably would have made him a difficult enough companion. Austin Clarke, you know, a very kind of almost embittered man as well, you know, felt ill at ease with the Ireland that emerged after the War of Independence. Sean O'Whalon, I once wrote to Sean O'Whalon when I was doing my thesis to ask him if he would help me, and he wrote back saying, thank you for your letter, but your professors should help you all you want. Goodbye, you know, more or less. So I didn't have a very good sense of you know, the one I think, from what I know of him, I would have liked meeting would be Beckett. Now everyone thinks of Beckett as this kind of grim reaper kind of guy, fail better, you know, fail again, fail better, you know. But actually, if you read about him, he was a guy who was interested in lots of things, and he was quite a good companion, and he was, you know, he enjoyed rugby, and he enjoyed a lot of things that I would have enjoyed talking to him about. So I think I kind of feel I might have enjoyed, but the one I enjoyed meeting most was Seamus Heaney, who's a wonderful man. You know, I mean, really, I miss him because I didn't know him very well, but I knew him well enough to appreciate his absolutely wonderful combination of brilliance and humanity. And that's a very difficult combination to strike brilliance and humanity. You know, a brilliant poet, brilliant insights, but a humane, you know, a kind of a fairly normal human being that you have a normal discussion with. You know, I remember that the last time I met him, I was buying a popular novel for a long flight to Australia, and I kind of got a bit embarrassed. I was talking to a Nobel Prize winner, and I was holding a novel that I wouldn't normally read, except on a long flight when you need to get something that you can get a read and keep you going.
Get you through, yes.
For a 20-hour flight to Australia. But you know, he didn't bat an eyelid. he didn't embarrass me by saying, "What are you reading that junk for? Why don't you read some serious literature instead?" You know. Anyway, so yeah, so I mean, that's my answer to the question. I think I probably would have enjoyed Beckett. You know, I mean, you know, again, Shaw would have probably driven you mad. He would have talked you to death. You know, I mean, Wilde would have been a bit difficult to deal with as well, I suspect. So I think, in a way, Beckett would have been the most straightforward guy to deal with. But Seamus Heaney definitely takes the award for the most accessible and sort of, you know, normal kind of guy that you could meet, having the brilliance of the writer as well in his character.
I think that resonates very much with me, who never met him at all, but he spoke in Chicago not long before he died. And when you mentioned I miss him, I myself do too, just with that very limited contact from a far distance that I had. But I have so many notes that I took about your talk just now, and I was grateful that my curtains are drawn and my camera was off. I was nodding along, so often the neighbors might have begun to talk about what I was doing, nodding at my laptop. But I was very struck and remain always very struck by the connection that the people clearly had to the parallel state that they were contributing to in this period of, as you say, the guerrilla war, which played its role, no question. But I wonder if part of the reason the British realized that this era was coming to a close was that they had, in terms of governance, you are quite right that they remained in control of the island. But in terms of the people's kind of endorsement of the government under which they lived, that was almost gone. They had stopped paying their taxes for the most part. And as you say, they were participating in the Sinn Féin courts. So I just wonder if you see that as formative too of this period, the parallel counter-state. Yeah.
Like what always puzzles me about that period is that if you'd had a referendum in 1914, say in February, March 1914, and you'd offered home rule or the status quo or something else, home rule would have won decisively. So in other words, and if you look at the response in Ireland to the passage of the Home Rule Bill was one of jubilation. And then, you know, 4 years later, Home Rule was kind of out the window. It wasn't even close to being enough to satisfy the Irish public. So what happened in that 4 years? How did this happen? These are the same people, right? We didn't suddenly drop people in from Mars that changed the whole complexion of our politics. It was the same people who were happy with Home Rule. My own view of this is that actually Home Rule was just about acceptable in 1914, and the delay in Home Rule meant that it was no longer acceptable because the other thing was, I think, that the sense that you know, the idea all along had been that well, if you have a majority in the House of Commons for a particular outcome, the House of Commons is in control. And then suddenly, when Home Rule came on the statute book, that didn't happen because you had a rebellion in Ulster, which the Conservative Party actually supported.
Right.
And I think that was really the first kind of Irish people at that time, you know, I believe would have seen that as well, you know, we'll never get we will never get even a modest version of self-government that the Home Rule Bill offered. And that, I think, drove people over the edge. And then I think the kind of wartime experience of people, you know, large numbers of people died. Remember, Irish people died in the war coming back from the Western Front and from Gallipoli of deaths of people, particularly. I think just undermined the sort of that support that was there for a kind of a more moderate version self-government, and then people just wanted more. And when they were given a chance to vote for something that went well beyond home rule, they did it.
They
and
looked
if you
at
look
it.
at the 1918 election, I mean, extraordinary sea change. The previous election was in 1910, and there were 2 elections that year, and I mean, the Irish Party was totally in control. By 1918, they were decimated, and that is, and then of course, I do think that I mean, if you look at people who went to Ireland in 1920, 21, journalists, remember, you know, this was a kind of an era when people could travel, and American journalists turned up in Ireland. You know, that wouldn't have happened in the 19th century, for example. I mean, put it this way, I often said that if the Irish Volunteers had been around in the 1840s, they would have been crushed. You know, the fact is that, you know, in 1914, 15, 16, and beyond, the Irish Volunteers were able to basically have an armed force, you know, playing at, you know, preparing for a revolution,
Right.
without the British government clamping down on them at all. If that had happened in the 19th century, it had been kaput. They'd have been, you know, the leaders would have been taken off and sent to Australia, or perhaps executed for their troubles. So I do think that changing mentality, both in Ireland and in the wider world, including America and in Britain itself, meant that, you know, you couldn't behave in the 1920s as you could have behaved in the 1860s or 70s, when you could have asserted your power. That's why I think O'Connell was probably right not to hold the Clontarf mass meeting, because
Clontarf, right?
They would literally have, it could have caused the deaths of thousands of people at the time, you know. So definitely, you know, the will to hold Ireland was undermined by the War of Independence, by the various events that occurred, by international opinion building up against the British, and indeed by the sort of understanding that actually power was slipping away from Britain, and that these upstart revolutionaries were actually managing to do a reasonably good job in running the country.
I thank you. That is fantastic. We received a question about the role of what is today Northern Ireland. You mentioned Ulster just now. The question is, excuse me, I hope I get it right. Were the 6 counties of Northern Ireland involved in the War of Independence?
Yes, but the War of Independence, I mean, yes, I mean, but of course, in Northern Ireland, what's now Northern Ireland, then it was Ulster, you had a different situation, because you had a majority of the population there, well, about half the population were totally opposed to the IRA, the Irish Volunteers. So nationalists in Northern Ireland had to be much more careful. I mean, you know, in places like Cork and Tipperary, and Limerick, and Waterford, where most of the War of Independence fighting took place, apart from Dublin, of course, which was also a place where it happened. But the ambushes that occurred in the southern part of Ireland, they took place in communities that were 95% nationalist and Catholic. So, you know, insurgents could melt into the population, and very difficult to find them, except by having reprisals that then made things even worse. Whereas in Northern Ireland, that wasn't the case. There were no safe havens in the same sense. That's why in 1918, the Irish Party held on to the seats it held on to were mainly in what's now Northern Ireland, because nationalists there didn't really go the whole way with Sinn Féin. They were willing to stick with the Irish Party because they felt that was more likely to produce an outcome that might have kept Ireland united.
Together. Right. Thank you. That's great. I continue to go through the questions. Another question about legacy. How important was the Fenian legacy to the IRB of 1916 and forward, or 1919 and forward? And the questioner is thinking of Pierce's graveside oration for O'Donovan Rossa, and Pierce's belief that a blood sacrifice, which he expressed leading up to 1916, would deliver the goal of an independent Ireland.
Well, I mean, I'm as a civil servant and a person who's worked in the Irish Foreign Service for 42 years now. I'm obviously not an advocate of blood sacrifice, but at the same time, you know, you have to. I think you do have to put it in the context of the time. You know, I mean, you think about it. In 1914, people all over Europe rushed to enlist to fight in what was turned out to be the bloodiest war in human history. So I think when you kind of see these attitudes in Ireland, you shouldn't remove them from their context. You know, they like Pearse was part of the same generation that rushed to war in 1914, and he just rushed to a different war.
Yes.
So I do think you can't understand that period without seeing the kind of atmosphere that prevailed across the board all over Europe and beyond at that time. That people did have an attitude towards self-sacrifice that wouldn't be common today, but was certainly not uncommon at that time, and not just in Ireland, but beyond, and even more so in places like France and Germany and Britain, where millions of people literally flocked to enlist, to sacrifice themselves for their countries. And I mean, you asked about the IRB as well. Look, yes, the IRB was the direct descendant of the Fenian Brotherhood, and Fenianism was essentially a North American phenomenon, in my view. It had a very brief flowering in Ireland, and by the beginning of the 20th century, the Fenian movement in Ireland had, broadly speaking, disappeared. There were still a few people that kind of adhered to the old ways, and it was revived by American money and American influence. The man who revived the IRB in practice in Ireland was Thomas Clarke, who was an Irish emigrant to America, who was sent back by John Devoy and the and Irish Fenians in America, back to organize and to plan for the time when a rising might be feasible. And that time, of course, came during the First World War, when the perception that Britain was weakened by the First World War gave the IRB an opportunity to take over the Irish Volunteers and then orchestrate the Easter Rising. Pearse was a kind of a Thomas Jefferson figure. I mean, he wasn't a great military leader, nor was Jefferson. Jefferson was a pretty awful military leader, let's be honest. But he had that gift of words. And I'm not saying that the proclamation is up there with Jefferson's work on the Declaration, but it's a pretty decent piece of work, you'd have to say. And reading it today, you still get a certain kind of stir from it. It has a certain kind of resonance that has lasted the course, and it's a pretty enlightened document as well, and stuff about equality and recognition of different traditions and so forth. So I think that was Pearse's gift. And remember, of the signatories of the proclamation, Pearse, MacDonagh, Plunkett, Connolly, I think Ash as well. They were all people who had published work of some literary orientation. Mightn't have been the best poetry in the world, but in Pearse's case, he could occasionally rise to a reasonable standard. And MacDonagh was a pretty decent poet who might have developed further in his later life. So they were a literary kind of group. And the other thing to think about them is that they were so young. As I mentioned, they were all born in the 1880s and 1890s, even in the case of Collins and Plunkett. And they were the first generation of Irish Catholics who've been educated to the highest level because they benefited from the Catholic University and its successors into the 20th century, which eventually became UCD. And so they were the first generation of that kind. And I think the best source for that period is really Roy Foster's Vivid Faces, where he looks at the revolutionary generation. And they were a generation of people who had an idealism that we may find difficult to deal with today, but it was certainly there. It was part of the ether at that time. And it wasn't just in Ireland, it existed in other parts of Europe as well.
I think that's so well said, for sure. Thank you. A question now looking to the future. We've spent some time looking before the period you've addressed.
We'll be looking at the future as well, I think, yes.
Yeah, yes. A person has inquired, how does Ireland plan to commemorate now in this moment what is clearly a very complicated period in its history, so full of tension and triumph?
No, I mean, look, I think there have been, obviously it's difficult to commemorate anything at the moment because you can't have big events. But I mean, I think there will be a commemoration in the coming days of Bloody Sunday. There was a commemoration of Terence McSweeney's death, and so on. So I mean, of Kevin Barry's death. So these things are being dealt with, but obviously big events are not possible at the moment. The trickiest centenary will come, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and then the Civil War that followed. That's going to be that will be the mother of all commemorations, because it will require the kind of nuance and subtlety that I think we've so far shown that we have that capacity to be nuanced and subtle when we commemorate our past. But this will be a the bar has been raised now, because this is clearly in any kind of any kind of calculus, this is the most difficult bit of the decade of centenaries that we have to deal with. And I believe we'll deal with it, but I'm not quite sure yet how it's going to work. And that's why I'm keen to have these events next year to try out some ideas about how you can deal with, how you can approach the Civil War and come through it without sort of spreading any kind of renewed bitterness about the events. I think the fact that it's 100 years ago does help a lot. 50 years, no, because if 50 years, some of the people involved are still around. 75 years, their children are around. Now you're talking about grandchildren, and maybe even beyond that. So, it's a little easier, I think, to deal with things when you don't have people tapping on the shoulder saying, no, it wasn't like that. I was there and I know how it is.
Right. My father, my grandfather, right.
So the passage of time makes commemorations that bit easier, I think, to deal with. And I think 100 years is that kind of passage of time, which means that there's no one directly involved, neither people themselves nor their children are really around anymore to pass judgment on these issues. But it'll still be difficult. But I think I'm confident on the basis of our record over the last 8 years of commemorations, I'm confident that we can rise to this challenge as well.
And I think with the sensitivity that you and your colleagues within your own ministry, but throughout the government have already shown, I think that's just huge for that. And I know we all wish you very well in the government in planning and working on those events. I see that we're getting close to time. I want to see if any of the other panelists would have a question. I'm not sure. Oh yeah, is that David? Thank you, go ahead.
So Ambassador Mulhall, thank you very much for just a wonderful talk. And I just wanted to ask you a current events question. And I'm just wondering, given your intricate understanding of 20th century Irish history and the struggle of the Irish people to gain independence, do you think that this understanding that you have gives you any particular insights into any particular group around the globe who is seeking independence now?
Well, what I would say there is that over the last 100 years, we have, I think, been a source of inspiration, not just in the independence struggle, but even our emergence as a modern sort of dynamic economy in the last, say, 20 years has inspired a lot of other European countries that joined the EU more recently to sort of look at us and say, how did you do? We want to do the same as you. And a lot of countries from, when I was in Asia, it wasn't our independence struggle that people were interested in. It was a lot more to do with how we managed to make this kind of transition from an agricultural, underperforming economy to a leading economy with a high technology specialization. So I do think that we we have been a source of inspiration. Now, in terms of what I say about present conflicts is that I think our conflict in the 1920s or the teens and 20s, that's kind of that's back there and that was then, and the world today is a different place. But I think more relevant really is the Northern Ireland peace process, because that's something that could be replicated elsewhere. And the lessons for me from that are that, first of all, you have to eliminate violence initially. You have to remove the violence from the equation. You have to get the parties to say, okay, we're going to talk. As John Hume, the great Irish peacemaker, said, we have to spill our sweat and not our blood. That has to be the first step. And the other lesson I take from it, I remember a line from W.B. Yeats in a different context, that peace comes dropping slow. And I remember just how long it took to achieve the kind of progress that eventually was achieved in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement. It was a painstaking process. And at times you felt like throwing the whole thing in, tearing your hair out and going, taking refuge in a monastery, you know, away from the world of this kind of stalemate, which was the, you know, the kind of default position for many years before we made the breakthrough in 1998. And the other thing is external assistance. You know, I mean, the European dimension was important, the American one more important, and also the fact that there were two governments involved, the British and Irish governments, that could work together and then eventually draw the parties in Northern Ireland into the equation and get them to go along with what was worked out under the aegis of Senator George Mitchell, to whom we owe an everlasting debt of gratitude.
Well, thank you very much. I want to highlight the comment in the chat, Ambassador. Thank you for those last quotations that you've given us on peace, and peace that comes dropping slow, and not just on the Lake Isle of Innisfree, I hope. But I will turn it now over to Kevin. We are at time. Thank you to all the attendees for your questions. I owe a couple of you an apology for not getting to your question. I beg your pardon. I'm very sorry about that, but come back to the other events. Kevin, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Ambassador. A wonderful tour, both through Irish history and Irish poetry, and I know we really look forward to the coming events next year, to that series, which we'll share with all of you through our social media and our Twitter. I'd just like to thank you all for joining. To our partners in the DePaul Centre for Irish Studies, as always, thank you so much for your support and for working with us on this. To the Grace Centre of Applied Diplomacy, thank you. And again, to the Newberry Library, thank you for all of your support. And of course, to our speaker, Ambassador, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and your insights. I know it was really very much appreciated by everybody here. A recording of the event will be available on our social media channels. We're at Ireland Chicago on Twitter, and you can search for us on Facebook. That's where the video will go. I just want to thank everybody again for this evening. And to you all for joining, and thank you so much, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.